The sound echoing through Russia tonight isn't the boom of artillery or the chime of frozen markets. It is the distinct, chilling sound of betrayal, the sound of an irrevocable contract being shredded. For more than 20 years, Vladimir Putin's power was founded on a singular, brutal promise to the powerful. Loyalty buys you immunity. Obedience buys you infinite wealth. I will protect you from the chaos, from the law, and from the West. Tonight, that promise is broken. And the men who bet their fortunes on Putin, the oligarchs, are running for the exits, dragging their assets, their families, and their vast criminal networks with them. What is happening inside Putin's inner circle isn't just political turbulence. It is the beginning of the end of the illusion that his cartel, because that's what Russia is, a cartel built on money, fear, and silence, can withstand external pressure. The silence is shattering because the foundation of the system, the transferability of loyalty into protection, has failed spectacularly. The system is consuming itself, and the first to be consumed are the very people who were supposed to be immune. The billionaires who bought the keys to the country in the post-Soviet fire sale. Let's rewind for a second, because you cannot understand the current collapse unless you understand how this fragile, hyper-centralized structure was built in the first place. When Vladimir Putin first took office in 1999, Russia was not a functioning state. It was a scene of chaos. The ruble had collapsed, the government had defaulted on its debts, and the population was traumatized and humiliated by the wild, corrupt capitalism of the 1,990 seconds. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability, but also maximum opportunity. Putin, the quiet, disciplined ex-KGB operative, understood that in a broken country, power doesn't come from a new ideology. It comes from one thing, the promise of order. And the fastest way to create the illusion of order was to tame the chaotic, newly minted billionaires, the oligarchs, who had emerged by buying up the Soviet state's industrial jewels, oil, gas, metals, telecommunications for pennies. They were rich, arrogant, untouchable, and profoundly hated by the Russian populace. Putin's genius was not to nationalize their assets like the Soviets, but to personalize the relationship. He offered them the pact. You can keep your billions. You can continue to operate your empires. But there are strict conditions. You must stay out of politics. You must financially, symbolically, and publicly support me. And in return, I will provide the one thing you desperately need. Protection from the chaos, from the state bureaucracy, and most importantly, from each other. This was not communism. It was not capitalism. It was Kremlin capitalism, a fusion where state resources were private trusts managed for the benefit of one man and his inner circle. Gazprom wasn't the people's company. It was Putin's treasury. Rosneft was his war chest. Every regional governor, every CEO, every oligarch owed his life and his lifestyle literally to the Kremlin's favor. The fate of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man and CEO of the oil giant Yukos, served as the immutable warning. He dared to criticize Putin on television in 2003. Within months, he was arrested, his company dismantled and seized, and he spent 10 years in a Siberian prison. The lesson was learned across the elite. Loyalty meant protection, disloyalty meant destruction. For 2 decades, this system worked flawlessly. The Russian elite lived like kings, enjoying London penthouses, Mediterranean yachts, and Western financial services, all while using Russia's vast energy wealth to cement Putin's domestic grip. This created the paradox that is now causing the system to implode. Russia declared itself sovereign and defiant, while its wealth and its elite were fundamentally dependent on the West for legitimacy, security, and luxury. The country's power was built on imported microchips, Western credit, and offshore banking secrecy. That dependence is why the sanctions regime, which has now targeted over 1,800 Russian individuals and entities, is so uniquely potent. The sanctions didn't destroy Russia's oil wells. They destroyed the transferability of the oligarchs' wealth. They didn't hit the state. They hit the individual who had been promised immunity. The targeted list reads like a roll call of Putin's financial architecture. Roman Abramovich, Alisher Usmanov, Oleg Deripaska. These men controlled the non-state levers of power. Now, they are watching their $100 million yachts seized in Mallorca, their villas in Sardinia marked for investigation, and their children suddenly stripped of access to Western schools and financial networks. The Kremlin initially laughed, dismissing it as, let them eat their yachts. But the core truth about oligarchs is simple. They do not forgive the loss of status, and they absolutely do not tolerate being poor. The moment the system failed to deliver on its primary promise protection, the loyalty dissolved. We are now witnessing the slow-motion defection of the elite. This is not happening on the battlefield, but in the most sensitive financial boardrooms and private offices. When billionaires begin shifting their families to Dubai, their holding companies to Kazakhstan, and their cash into crypto wallets in the UAE, it is not strategic relocation. It is escape. They are attempting to get their names off the sanctions lists, not out of any newfound morality, but out of self-preservation, proving that their loyalty was entirely conditional on their personal financial security. This defection is magnified by the economic collapse that Putin's regime can no longer mask. The promised stability is dissolving beneath a flood of catastrophic metrics. Foreign reserve loss. Russia has lost more than $320 billion in foreign reserves since the invasion began. Money that was supposed to be the nation's impenetrable financial fortress. Currency instability. The ruble's volatility, dropping from a stable 70 to over 100 per dollar, even with desperate capital controls, highlights the market's complete lack of confidence in the Kremlin's economic management. The ruble, touted as a symbol of sovereignty, has become a symbol of fragility. Inflation crisis. Inflation soared to nearly 17.8%, severely cutting into the purchasing power of the average Russian and creating acute economic distress, forcing Moscow to stop publishing full, reliable data entirely to hide the depth of the crisis. Compounding this financial chaos is the brain drain. Over 1.3 million Russians, largely the highly educated, mobile, and technologically critical workforce engineers, IT specialists, doctors have fled the country. This isn't just a number. It's the amputation of Russia's future technological and intellectual capacity. You can mobilize farmers and convicts for the front line, but you cannot replace the specialized knowledge required to run a 21st century economy. The Kremlin's attempt to isolate the country from the West has instead caused a mass self-exile of its most valuable human capital. The most profound shift, however, is linguistic and political. The crisis has eroded the language of obedience. Regional autonomy, regional governors, once absolute cheerleaders for Putin, are beginning to murmur quietly about the need for economic autonomy to shield their own regions from the federal government's policy blunders. Military dissent, defense officials, traditionally silent and professional, are leaking frustration about chronic supply issues and institutional corruption that undermines the war effort. The code word. Even the highly controlled Orthodox Church has shifted its language, moving from explicit support for the war to cautious euphemisms about the need for peace. The most telling political signal is the shift in public framing. Nobody in the elite says, we support Putin anymore. They say, we support stability. This act of linguistic distance is how rigid systems begin to politically fracture. It shows that the loyalty is no longer personal, it is purely transactional and conditional on the system's survival. The political myth of Putin as the sole, indispensable guarantor of order is now being actively dismantled by the very people he empowered. The moment the sanctions proved that Putin could not protect his oligarchs' yachts and villas, the fear, the single most important ingredient of his power, began to run out. And when the fear runs out, the rigid structure of the cartel must inevitably crack. This is the ultimate self-consumption of an empire built on the conditional loyalty of the greedy. The next phases of this story will detail how the system attempts to cannibalize itself to survive. If you believe the irreplaceable loss of technological human capital through brain drain is the deepest long-term wound to the Russian state, type brain drain in the comments below. The system Vladimir Putin built was based on a simple exchange: obedience for impunity. Part 1 detailed how the foundation of this contract, the promise of protection, was shattered by Western sanctions, leading to the panicked defection of the oligarchic class. Now, Part 2 must dissect the mechanics of the collapse, analyzing precisely how the economic war is translating into political entropy and fracturing the cartel that has ruled Russia for 2 decades. The key is understanding that sanctions didn't just target money. They targeted the symbolism of status and the psychology of power. For 2 years, the Kremlin dismissed the sanctions as a Western tantrum, a mere annoyance that Russia's vast energy wealth and financial reserves could easily absorb. But the sanctions were not a single blunt instrument. They were a complex, layered assault designed to attack the system's structural vulnerabilities. They performed 3 primary functions that are now destroying the elite's confidence: liquidity freeze, luxury starvation, and legitimacy strip. The liquidity freeze was the immediate, painful shock. By sanctioning virtually every major Russian bank and freezing access to over $320 billion in sovereign reserves held abroad, the West effectively cut the main arteries of Russian capital. But more critically, the secondary sanctions targeting financial institutions dealing with sanctioned entities forced key individuals like Roman Abramovich and Oleg Deripaska to immediately deal with a crippling truth: their billions, once fluid and global, were now illiquid and trapped. The seizure of yachts in Majorca and villas in Sardinia was not just about the monetary value. It was about demonstrating that the Western financial system, which they had trusted to safely store and legitimize their wealth, had now turned into a weapon against them. Their wealth was suddenly useless for its primary purpose: mobility, status, and international leverage. This led directly to luxury starvation. The oligarchic class operates on a principle of visible, conspicuous consumption. Their power is derived from their ability to live above the law and beyond the borders of Russia's dysfunction. The freezing of their assets, the grounding of their private jets, and the exclusion of their children from European schools were deliberate psychological strikes. These actions told the elite, your loyalty to Putin no longer buys you the one thing you care about: your Western lifestyle. This forced a cognitive break. The system, which they had endured because of the lavish rewards it guaranteed, was no longer rewarding, it was punishing. This is the moment the conditional loyalty turned into active self-preservation. The legitimacy strip is the most politically corrosive function. The sanctions and the global condemnation that followed effectively branded the entire oligarchic class as pariahs, criminals, and war profiteers. Their wealth, which was previously a source of international business prestige, is now globally recognized as stolen state property. This stripping of legitimacy makes it nearly impossible for them to secure new credit, operate complex international businesses, or even travel freely. They are not just poor, they are untouchable. This forces the billionaires into a desperate search for new safe havens, catalyzing the slow-motion defection seen across the globe. We see this defection playing out in 3 distinct phases. The Great Asset Shuffle. Oligarchs are frantically transferring legal ownership of assets: private jets, holding companies, luxury properties to family members, obscure trusts in the UAE, or friendly parties in non-sanctioning countries like Turkey and Kazakhstan. This complex financial restructuring aims to create enough distance between the individual and the asset to evade immediate seizure, a clear sign that they no longer trust the Kremlin to provide legal or financial defense. The geographical shift. There is a pronounced migration of the ultra-wealthy and their business operations away from Moscow to regional hubs that offer a veneer of neutrality and stability. Dubai and Istanbul have become major hubs for Russian flight capital, providing the transactional safety the West once offered. This migration is not patriotic. It is a flight from state control, effectively decoupling the elite's financial fate from the political fate of the Kremlin. The linguistic distance. The elite are publicly demonstrating their withdrawal of political capital. The subtle shift from "we support Putin" to "we support stability" is the most potent political indicator. It is a calculated move to establish distance in case of a regime change. They are attempting to buy political insurance, signaling to potential successors or even to the West that their primary concern is the continuity of their wealth, not the continuation of Putin's rule. This internal fracturing at the top has led to political entropy at the regional level, the next critical weakness in Putin's centralized pyramid. Russia is not a unified federal state. It is a mosaic of deeply autonomous regions held together by a single vertical line of power flowing directly from Putin. Regional governors. The regional governors are Putin's appointed feudal lords, whose power is also conditional on the Kremlin's financial support. As the central budget is strained by the war and sanctions, the flow of subsidies and federal grants to these regions is shrinking. When the money dries up, the regional governors' men who once chanted Putin's slogans begin to prioritize local survival. They start murmuring about economic autonomy, demanding more control over local tax revenues and resources to shield their regions from the central government's economic blunders. This is not open rebellion, but it is the erosion of federal authority, the first dangerous crack in the state structure. If the governors begin acting in their own interests, the centralized command structure necessary to prosecute the war will quickly dissipate. The combined effect of the elite defection and the regional entropy is the destruction of the illusion of omnipotence. Putin spent 2 decades convincing Russians and the world that his power was absolute, permanent, and impervious to external pressure. The sight of the elite running, the ruble plunging, and regional governors voicing dissent shows the world that the modern state is, in reality, a brittle, dependent cartel that is quickly losing its internal coherence. The sanctions, by attacking the symbolic contract of obedience and protection, have unleashed the very chaos that Putin promised to prevent. If you believe the loss of international legitimacy and status is the primary driver of the oligarchs' defection and internal fracturing, type status pariah in the comments below. The slow-motion collapse of the Kremlin cartel, driven by the flight of the elite and the fracturing of regional obedience, is now accelerating toward a far more dangerous consequence: the destruction of the national myth. Vladimir Putin did not just promise economic stability, he promised identity. For 2 decades, he sold the Russian people a powerful, consumable narrative that he alone could protect them from the humiliation of the Soviet collapse and the moral decay of the West. This narrative, built on the pillars of sovereignty, strength, and superiority, is now being actively dismantled by the very economic realities he created. The ultimate failure of the system is the failure of the story. The myth of sovereignty is the first casualty. Putin insisted that Russia was a self-sufficient great power, independent and immune to foreign pressure. The sanctions, however, exposed a dependency so deep that it is structurally crippling. The Russian military, the symbol of national strength, cannot fight a modern war without imported microchips and Western machine tools. The Russian economy, the source of its political leverage, cannot function without European technology and global financial networks. The exodus of over 1,300 foreign companies, from software giants to essential parts manufacturers, revealed that the Russian economy, at its technological heart, was merely an assembly state, dependent on foreign supply chains for everything from cars and airplanes to sophisticated medical equipment. This leads directly to the crisis of import substitution. When the West withdrew, the Kremlin promised a swift shift to domestic production, often dubbed the sovereign economy strategy. This program is failing disastrously. The domestic industrial base lacks the capacity, the technology, and crucially, the skilled human capital to replace what was lost. The quality of domestic goods is often inferior, and production volumes are insufficient. For example, Russian automobile production has fallen off a cliff, forcing the resurrection of outdated Soviet-era models lacking modern safety and technical features. This tangible daily downgrade in quality of life for the urban middle class, the loss of reliable cars, access to high-end electronics, and reliable medical technology is a daily, visible refutation of the promise of strength and progress. The myth is not just failing in the news reports, it is failing in the kitchen and on the road. The second core myth, that of strength and superiority, is being dismantled by the most corrosive long-term wound to the Russian state, the brain drain. The departure of over 1.3 million educated, mobile, and highly skilled professionals is an ongoing economic amputation. These are the engineers, the IT developers, the medical specialists, and the business managers who held the keys to Russia's 21st century economy. Their mass exit is an irreversible loss for several critical reasons. Technological obsolescence. Without these specialists, Russia's ability to maintain, repair, or upgrade its high-end industrial and military equipment degrades daily. The complex manufacturing processes needed for modern defense or essential infrastructure, like oil and gas pipelines, require highly specialized technical expertise that cannot be replaced by quickly trained recruits. The loss of these skills guarantees technological stagnation and obsolescence. Innovation cessation. The future of any economy relies on innovation and the creation of new high-value sectors. The emigrants were the very people who were supposed to drive the promised sovereign tech sector. Their departure ensures that Russia will be forced into a permanent technological dependence on less advanced or reliable partners, trapping the economy in the extraction and export of raw materials. Capital flight of the future. The brain drain is not just a statistical loss of personnel. It is a capital flight of the future. These individuals represent the highest return on the state's educational investment. Their skills are immediately absorbed by rival economies, Turkey, the UAE, European nations, while Russia is left with an increasingly low-skilled, aging, and war-depleted workforce. You can print rubles, but you cannot print a neural network engineer. This catastrophic hemorrhage of human capital is deepening the class divide in a politically toxic way. The young, educated, urban elite, the people who had benefited most from 2 decades of Western integration, have voted with their feet, abandoning the system they no longer believe in. What remains is a population that is older, more rural, and increasingly reliant on the state for both income and information. While the state can use propaganda to maintain the loyalty of this remaining core, the economic engine necessary to sustain that loyalty is being irreparably damaged by the absence of the creative class. The final pillar of the myth, the decisive leader, is failing as regional and political entropy accelerates. The fracturing of the elite pact is forcing regional governors to act in their own self-interest, creating fissures in the centralized power structure. Governors, realizing that federal subsidies are drying up and that the central government is consumed by the war, are quietly challenging Moscow's authority by demanding more control over local tax revenues and resources. This isn't yet open rebellion, but it is a severe weakening of the vertical chain of command. If the regional feudal lords begin to prioritize local survival over federal mandates, the state's ability to enforce its centralized decisions, from military mobilization quotas to resource allocation, will dissipate. This signals the return of the chaos of the 1,990 seconds, the very thing Putin promised to protect Russians from. The ultimate horrifying paradox is that Putin's attempt to project strength outward has created the precise internal conditions of instability and humiliation that he was put in power to prevent. The empire is cracking because the people who matter the money, the brains, and the regional power brokers no longer believe that Vladimir Putin is the sole, indispensable guarantor of their survival. The ultimate strategic loss is not on the battlefield, but in the final, irretrievable erosion of the foundational story that legitimized 2 decades of absolute rule. If you believe the irreversible failure of import substitution and the resulting decline in quality of life is the primary domestic pressure point on the Russian state, type failed subs in the comments below. The irreversible destruction of the national myth, coupled with the collapse of the economic firewall, has ushered in the most dangerous phase of the Kremlin's crisis: active political entropy. The failed pact is no longer a psychological problem. It is a profound governance failure, manifesting in critical institutions and crippling Moscow's ability to effectively prosecute the war or manage the vast machinery of the state. The defection of the oligarchs, detailed in the previous parts, has moved from financial escape to systemic political sabotage. The flight of capital and human expertise, which was initially perceived as mere self-preservation, is now actively degrading the functionality of the Russian government and the war effort. The wealthy elite, facing existential threats to their fortunes, are now utilizing their vast networks to actively insure against regime collapse. This insurance policy takes the form of calculated non-cooperation, quiet sabotage, and selective data leakage, all designed to signal to Western powers or potential future successors in Russia that they are not, and never were, fully aligned with the most disastrous policies of the current regime. This active defection manifests acutely in two critical areas: defense procurement and centralized data management. In defense procurement, the system is paralyzed by a toxic mix of internal fear and external pressure. Defense manufacturers and state-owned enterprises are theoretically mandated to fulfill massive war orders, but their ability to do so is crippled by the sanctions and the flight of technical talent. Instead of reporting these failures to Moscow, which would result in immediate political punishment, the SOEs are engaging in elaborate acts of fraudulent compliance. They report meeting quotas by delivering low-quality, incomplete, or functionally obsolete equipment. They inflate costs to skim shrinking federal subsidies. The vast networks of corruption that Putin once tolerated as a means of control have now become a self-destructive feedback loop, consuming the very resources needed for survival. The commanders on the front lines, desperate for modern equipment, are receiving unreliable supplies because the executives in Moscow are more afraid of their boss than of the enemy's bullets. This failure to deliver effective fighting capacity is a direct consequence of the political risk imposed on the economic elite. The failure of centralized data management is equally corrosive. Modern governance and military coordination rely entirely on accurate, real-time data flow. Yet, the brain drain has removed the essential IT specialists, engineers, and data scientists required to maintain, secure, and operate complex government and military networks. The remaining personnel, facing a collapsing system and internal purges, are choosing to engage in data silence, or worse, selective data corruption. They are hesitant to report accurate economic statistics, true casualty figures, or realistic production numbers for fear of inviting reprisal. The system is functionally blind, operating on optimistic fictions that guarantee strategic errors. Furthermore, the reliance on less secure, hastily implemented domestic software solutions, coupled with a depleted cybersecurity staff, opens the door to internal and external espionage and sabotage. The potential for key databases to be compromised, either by agents working for foreign powers or by disaffected insiders securing their insurance policy with the West, is now an existential threat to the state's coherence. This breakdown is causing a dangerous surge in political entropy at the regional level, accelerating the fracturing detailed in Part 3. The regional governors, seeing the paralysis and failure in Moscow, are realizing that their own survival depends not on the central government's grace, but on their ability to shield their local economies. Fiscal autonomy. Governors are quietly but firmly pushing back on federal tax collection mandates and demanding greater control over local revenues. This is a direct challenge to the Kremlin's financial authority, turning the vertical power structure into a series of competing regional fiefdoms. Warlordism of resources. As central allocation of vital goods like high-quality medical supplies or industrial components fails, regions are beginning to hoard critical resources. They prioritize local needs over federal military needs, effectively engaging in a form of economic civil war for dwindling resources. This undermines the war effort by denying the frontline essential supplies, but it ensures the local political survival of the governor. The ultimate irony of this internal consumption is that Putin's system, built to eliminate the chaos of the 1,990 seconds, is resurrecting it in a new, more technologically volatile form. The fear that once guaranteed order is now so profound that it compels the powerful to act in ways that guarantee disorder as a form of personal protection. The empire is cracking not with a single dramatic break, but through the silent, systematic self-cannibalization of its own economic, technological, and political infrastructure. The financial health of the state is being consumed by the corruption required to mask the system's failure, and the central command structure is being dissolved by the competing self-interests of the oligarchs and governors running for survival. If you believe the systemic fraud and fraudulent compliance in defense procurement is the most direct short-term threat to Russia's military capacity, type fraud paralysis in the comments below. The most potent ultimate irony of Putin's two-decade rule is that his singular success, eliminating the chaos and humiliation of the 1,990 seconds, has been completely undone by his own ambition. His efforts to project absolute strength outward have created the precise conditions of internal instability, technological degradation, and systemic fracture he was put in power to prevent. The chaos is returning, not through external revolution, but through the silent, systematic self-cannibalization of the institutions he controlled. The future of the Russian state, under the pressure of the failed pact, is now defined by two irreversible trajectories: permanent technological and economic degradation. The brain drain and the failure of import substitution guarantee that Russia's economy will continue its slide into a technologically backward resource extractive model. The lack of skilled personnel and access to modern components means that both the military and civilian sectors face obsolescence. This degradation limits Russia's power projection and reduces its long-term leverage on the global stage to a purely extractive, low-value proposition. Increased political fragmentation. The erosion of the vertical chain of command evidenced by the regional governors' push for fiscal autonomy and the systemic fraud in defense procurement will only accelerate. The Kremlin is losing its ability to enforce its will, leading to the rise of regional fiefdoms and internal resource competition. This fracturing creates a volatile, unpredictable security landscape threatening the unity of the Russian Federation itself. The strategic vulnerability of the regime is no longer external. It is internal. Putin's power relies on the perception of permanence and indispensability. The oligarchs' defection and the regional power struggles demonstrate that this perception is dissolving. The system is consuming itself, and the final stage is the collapse of the illusion of control. The empire is not being conquered. It is being consumed by the fear and fraud that were its own foundational ingredients. The ultimate takeaway from this comprehensive failure is a historical lesson. An empire built not on shared values, law, or genuine economic growth, but on conditional loyalty and centralized coercion, will inevitably collapse the moment its ruler can no longer guarantee the material self-interest of its elite. If you believe the irreversible decline in Russia's long-term power and stability is the necessary conclusion of this systemic breakdown, type IDLPS in the comments below. The four previous parts have detailed a process of systemic self-consumption, the shattering of the elite pact, the flight of capital and brains, the destruction of the national myth, and the paralysis of governance through internal fraud. Part 5 must now synthesize these consequences into a final assessment of the strategic outlook for the Russian state under Vladimir Putin. The most potent ultimate irony of Putin's two-decade rule is that his singular success eliminating the chaos and humiliation of the 1,990 seconds has been completely undone by his own ambition. His efforts to project absolute strength outward have created the precise conditions of internal instability, technological degradation, and systemic fracture he was put in power to prevent. The chaos is returning, not through external revolution, but through the silent, systematic self-cannibalization of the institutions he controlled. The future of the Russian state, under the pressure of